Hello everyone, I hope you hear me now. Welcome to what I think is the greenest session of the Green Week, apart from my tie. Nature is really the green element of all this, and this is specifically on nature restoration. I am Humberto Delgado Rosa. I'm Director for Biodiversity in DG Environment, the European Commission, and I have the privilege to be the moderator of this session on nature restoration. And I must tell you, restoration is the word I enjoy the most within nature and biodiversity because I think it is politically powerful. It brings a sense of hope, of something we can put back and not just about loss, and how can we have a political agenda without a message of hope. That's why you will find the nature restoration standing high in the very ambitious biodiversity strategy we have in the EU for 2030. It does include a EU nature restoration plan addressing all the main drivers of loss of biodiversity through commitments, targets, measures. And it also announces an upcoming nature restoration law to establish binding targets on nature restoration in the EU. All this within the UN decade of restoration that is ongoing. But now, what is restoration about? Do we mean passive restoration, we reduce the pressures and allow nature to come back? Do we mean active restoration, putting it back actively? Do we want to get to pristine nature again, pre-human maybe, historic, prehistoric, or something different from that? What's the reference level? We just want a trend of recovery. What's the end result? Where do we want to do it? In protected areas only? Everywhere maybe? At what time scale? Can we really do it? Do we really need it? And then, will we have room for everything we want to take from our land and our seas? What are the costs and benefits? I don't think we can address all of this in 1 hour, but we do have with us a very qualified panel that I will introduce to you. We have sitting here in the room, we have at that corner the well-known Janez Potočnik. He was the former Commissioner for the Environment and is presently co-chair of the UNEP International Resource Panel. And next to him we have Esmeralda Wirtz. She is the co-coordinator of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network in Europe. Then we have Gary Goggins. He is the Public Awareness Manager of the Life Integrated Project Wild Atlantic Nature. And online we have Hans Bruynings, the head of the European Environmental Agency. Thank you to all of you to being here with us. And I will start by raising a question to each of you. I will expect that you use some 5 minutes for that. There will be a follow-up, and I hope we have in the end some time for questions from the participants. And by the way, participants can submit any question they have for the Commission or for the panel in Slido. To submit the questions, you simply go to this Slido webpage and enter the hashtag EU Green Week. The online participants can also use the QR code shown on the screen, or I hope it will be on the screen for you. And I have my colleagues, my expert colleagues on restoration asking to you, replying to your questions and also selecting some questions that, if time allows, we will take with the panel. With this said, and Janez, starting with you, the world certainly faces many challenges, including those that relate to resource scarcity, overexploitation. What I would ask you is, would you give us your perspective and the global perspective indeed of how protecting and restoring biodiversity relates to resources challenges? And if I may, in particular on a very actual subject, does nature restoration stand in the way of food security, or does it contribute to food security? Janez, please.
Thanks a lot, Humberto. It's good to be here again, dear friends. We are, as we are all noticing, living in quite strange times. So, on one hand, first COVID and now the terrible war in Ukraine, it's bringing quite a lot of challenges. And as you know, the governments today are discussing a lot about how to tackle potential food scarcity, food security, energy security. We are dealing with the highest inflation pressures as we have noticed in the last decades. So all that are serious challenges, but what I think it's important is to understand that while it is really paramount to deal with all those questions, that we cannot simply afford to discontinue with the sustainability efforts, because prescribing painkillers, trying to remove merely the short-term pain, will unfortunately not heal our diseases. And that's why it is crucial that at this moment we think very carefully about what actions we are taking, because this is actually very much setting the path of potential future crises. So simply it's not the time to call off the Green Deal, ambitious, necessary policy framework. It's not time to question the good intentions and the vision of the farm to fork strategy. Rather, we should work and understand well how fragile our economies and societies are, and how very dependent we actually are also on the rest of the world, and how we are connected. But you asked about the food security, and I think here we need to be pretty clear what is food security about and what is food security actually not about. If I would start what is not about, it's not only about intensification and producing more on a hectare. It's not about plugging up nature areas to grow more food for livestock. Livestock is an essential part of our farming system, but there is a clear evidence that we are over-consuming and also overproducing the livestock products. Therefore, holding up and sustaining the size of the livestock sector does really not contribute to the long-term food security. Then it's about prioritizing food for direct human consumption over the food produced for animal feed. It's about addressing healthy diets, obesity, overconsumption. It's about fresh look, taking to about marine production systems that have the capacity to deliver multiple benefits. Aquaculture to produce seaweeds and bivalves, it's, for example, a great option because this can absorb nutrients directly from their environment and therefore not depend on the feedstock. It's also about amazing agricultural approaches, techniques like precision farming, like vertical farming, like agroecology, like producing meat analogs. It's about caring for restoring pollinators, healthy soils, resilient forests. It's about how much of the food we still waste, which is actually not only the food which is waste, it's also the land, the energy, the pesticides, everything used for the production of that food. But more than that, it's also about policies which do not directly relate to food. It's, for example, about biofuels, how much of them we feed to people and how much to the cars. It's about fertile land we use for many infrastructure projects. It's about land which is swallowed by urban expansions and new space required by our inefficient resource-consuming mobility systems. All that, it's about food security, which we normally do not take into account when we talk about food security. All that is, by the way, also about the biodiversity. But this multiple approach, which I'm talking about, it's kind of counterintuitive at this moment to policy leaders and also to media logic and response. While it's not strange to us sitting in this room, because we know very well that this multiple approach is actually the only way how to hold back the planetary crisis. So here, the cumulative effect of many positive system-changing decisions, it's actually the only safe pathway of keeping a stable and safe world within our reach. So we have to be aware that while we are dealing with those crises, we are dealing also with a chronic, systemic, environmental, and social crisis. And the triple multiple planetary crises are simply making the instability the norm. What is the role of natural resources, which you also asked? Natural resources, their use actually sits in the center of triple planetary crisis. According to IRP, which I'm co-chairing, we have tripled the use of materials, that is everything extracted from the earth, in the last 50 years. and it will double again till 2060 if we don't make fundamental changes. This use, extraction and use, it's causing approximately half of climate effects, 90% of land-related biodiversity loss and water stress, and about 1/3 of pollution effects, health effects. So nature restoration is without any doubt extremely important. But while we deal with it, while this message of hope, which you mentioned, we have to bring, we have to be aware that we need to remove the drivers leading us to those situations, because if we don't remove them, then restoration will not help us a lot, because it will be just constantly need for more and more restoration. So we have our main problem is that we have never really separated economic growth from ever-rising demand of resources, which points to the fact that we are now, in particular in high-income countries, Europe included, very much overstepping planetary boundaries and living out of the safe operating space. So, link to resource use. So we need to link the resource use not so much from the point of view of maximizing the sector's outputs, but maximizing the human needs. And we need to simply refuse that should be resource intensive. We actually don't need cars, we need mobility. We don't need chairs, we need to sit. We don't need refrigerator, we need a fresh and healthy food. And if we would put this system a bit upside down, I think we could make it very much different. To conclude, I firmly believe that nature is our most powerful ally in the quest for food security, for biodiversity protection. So bringing back healthy ecosystems is a precondition also to help farmers avoid crop failures and stave off the impact of climate change on agricultural land. In other words, it's our safest bet to ensure that in the future of the earth we will be able to produce enough food to feed the people. And the European Union's upcoming nature restoration law is, for me, an essential part of the solution, and making our economies and societies more resilient based on sustainable social, environmental, economic system is our best defense. And we have simply to work in that direction. As I have pointed in recently published op-ed, one thing is certain: Europe's hesitation when it comes to nature protection and restoration is short-sighted, it's misleading, and it's even self-destructive.
Thank you very much, Yanis, to show us these links between so many issues that need to be integrated, and also pointing out the links of restoration and some keywords you said: pollinators, soil, regenerative agriculture, and addressing overexploitation of resources. I'll come back to you, but allow me now to move to Esmeralda. Esmeralda, I think it's fair to say that's quite a lot of expectation on the use, on how they influence policy making. We have seen so much growing youth activism, noticeably in terms of climate activism in Europe and around the world. But I wonder, do you think that your generation is less inclined to act for nature than for climate? And do you think that nature restoration is or can become more relevant to the younger generations than to the older generations? Your say, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd first like to jump on what you first said, that there are a lot of expectations on youth to take action, to influence policymakers, to be on the ground, basically to be everywhere solving the issues. But I think that this should not be an excuse so that the older generations don't do anything. So I'm happy to see that there are many people here in the room who are probably already taking action. But there is still a lot of pressure on youth when we are doing work that is mostly unfunded on a voluntary basis, and we don't have unlimited capacity. And I've seen so many people around me with mental health, with burnout issues, because they are doing that on top of their job, on top of their studies. So this is actually quite a hard situation because we want to be involved. We are pushing to be involved, but at the same time, we can't keep doing this without adequate finances, adequate resources, and actually meaningful engagement in decision-making processes. So this is something that I wanted to start pointing out. We are definitely very interested in nature restoration. Under the lead of Generation Climate Europe, we have written a youth position paper on nature restoration, hoping also that policymakers would use it for their new EU restoration law. You can find it on the Generation Climate Europe website. We have collaborated on this with the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And we think we are not the only ones because you mentioned the gap between like climate activism and biodiversity activism. I think there is like two sides on this coin. The first one is that if you go to youth climate activist strikes, actually you see a lot of messages that are related to biodiversity. You see a lot of people with signs saying save the bees or we are nature defending itself, or a lot of biodiversity messages, but that are under the umbrella of the climate term. And I think this only reflects what in our global society we have as well, because if you look at the media, they point out climate issues much more than biodiversity issues. The climate COP gets increasing media coverage every year, while the biodiversity COP, most people don't even know that it exists. So I think these concerns that youth have are only reflecting what is happening in the general society. And at the same time, when I see all these messages together at the strike, I'm just thinking, like as pointed out by the previous speaker, they are not wrong, because in the end, the root causes of the climate crisis and of the biodiversity crisis are just the same. They are overexploitation, they are capitalism. If you look at the global level, they are colonialism. So these are all together, like we can't tackle one crisis if we don't tackle the other one. So I think those messages are actually supported by the youth, but maybe not always with the adequate and very practical terminology, which might also be due to the fact that the IPCC started working, I think, over 30 years ago on climate issues and getting media coverage, while IPBES, the expert group on biodiversity, only started like 10 years ago. So I think this is also maybe one of the causes of why we see this gap between the climate and the biodiversity activism among youth. And then to get to the last part of your question, how restoration could become more and more important for the young generation and even the generations to come. As you're saying, restoration brings a message of hope. But at the same time, we can't rely our future on hopes, because if we rely only on nature restoration but keep destroying, we are never going to end the restoration work. So I think this is important to point out, that we can't only rely on restoration, obviously. So it is super important. We are aware of this, and what we want is only to be involved, and to be involved meaningfully and with adequate resources. Because I see also many people in my group that are looking for jobs in nature restoration, but can't actually access to jobs because there are no paid jobs or not enough paid jobs in this field. And yeah, so we are concerned, but it's absolutely impossible to do everything on a voluntary basis. Most fundings that are available are not directly available to stakeholder groups and rights holder groups, such as youth, women, indigenous people who are working on the ground on nature restoration. So this is, just two sides of the same coin. We want to be involved, but we have limited capacity. So without funding that is directly accessible, and without making sure that most of the funding does not stay at the higher levels of the bureaucracy, but actually reaches the people who are working in their local communities on nature restoration, I think this is a very important point that is also elaborated more in the youth position paper on nature restoration. So these are the things I wanted to point out. I think it very much aligns with what has been said before. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ronaldo, thank you very much. I think I took very good note that we cannot use the youth as an excuse, this half-failed generation of mine, and that financing and capacity building will certainly be relevant. Also showed very well that we often speak of two, three crises, biodiversity, climate, pollution. In practice, we probably have only one, which is a sustainability crisis. And also, you said restoration not enough. We also need protection and much more, as Janus also pointed out. But I hope the nature restoration law will maybe create the needs, the skills and the jobs on the restoration to come. Again, I'll get back to you, but it's the time to hear Hans, that is online with us, Hans Breunings from the EEA. Hans, you have been watching and reporting on the declining state of nature from a facts-based perspective, using all available technologies, including Earth observation. Would you tell us about your views on the scale and the urgency of the challenge that our ecosystems face? And if, in your view, there's still time and room for meaningful restoration in the EU, or does it stand in the way of other needs, be it infrastructure, again, food, mining, energy, or whatever else? Hans, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Umberto, and it's great to be with you, even if it's only virtual. Well, I think it's rather obvious that there is an urgent need to take biodiversity and ecosystems very seriously. And they don't stand, investing in them doesn't stand in the way of other objectives. They are indeed foundational to reach other objectives in the long term. And to take the audience back just 2 decades, in 2000, the EU promised that we would halt biodiversity loss. And in 2010, the agency, together with other partners, we looked at the results and we said, no, we're not there. We're not halting biodiversity loss. So in 2010, we said, you know what, we'll do it by 2020, but we're now 2022 and we haven't managed to do that. And that is really a rather fundamental failure. And now we are coming, luckily, with a world-leading biodiversity strategy, including the really important and I think groundbreaking new target of nature restoration. But it means that we will have to fundamentally turn around a negative trend. And to give you an idea, only less than 1 in 7 ecosystems and habitats in Europe is in good status. So the challenge is phenomenal. And this is completely compatible with what the IPBES that was referred to already is talking about, the 6th great extinction. And it's the panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So if we lose the ecosystems, we will also lose the services. And this is at a moment when we are continuously hearing that we need to go to nature-based solutions. It seems to be the new panacea. Well, we will not have strong solutions based on declining nature. That is absolutely obvious. And then to make a link with what Janus has already said, it means that we need to go to the fundamental drivers of ecosystem decline. And we know what they are. It's fragmentation, it's land use that is unsustainable, it's agriculture that is unsustainable, to which Janus referred extensively, it's urban sprawl, it's pollution, and increasingly it is also, as an almost additional driver, climate change itself. So if we are serious about addressing biodiversity and restoration, those are the things that we should be focusing on. And of course, we need to protect more nature, and we need credible management plans to do that in the proper way, which is often not the case. But we are not going to save biodiversity on 20 or 30% of the territory. We will have to do it through changing the systems that are driving biodiversity loss. And that means our system, our food system, our industrial production system. Those are the key systems that we need to look at. Now, luckily, we know a lot about these systems and how to do this. What stands in the way is not knowledge. What stands in the way is the drivers, the incentive structures of an economic system that uses resources, natural resources, biodiversity, ecosystem services at almost no cost in the production, but at also no cost when the damage is done. Because the whole principle of the polluter pays is actually focused on a rather limited set of elements of pollution, but not on the damage to ecosystems and biodiversity. So the system that we have that should drive change is actually not working very well. And we have even developed intellectually nonsensical language around this. We now say that we are using 1.6 planets. Well, guess what? There is no 0.6 planet. It only means that we are overusing, depleting, polluting, mismanaging the one planet that we have. So it's about time that we take the knowledge seriously and that we indeed truly invest in a credible strategy that turns around negative trends and that fundamentally invests indeed in what Europe is now putting on the table, or later on in June, a nature restoration law, and that we have the courage to go to what is actually driving the decline and will be instrumental in turning these trends around.
Thank you very much, Hans, for bringing this perspective on systemic change, indeed, that we need. It's not just looking a bit to biodiversity and then a bit to pollution. And indeed, changing the food system, the industrial system, indeed the economic system, which is a bit incomplete, I think is what the EU Green Deal, which remains as powerful as ever, is all about. Thank you very much. And I'll move to Gary. And Gary, you have been the one hands-on on dealing with nature protection and restoration in Ireland. So I'm very eager to hear you on what it can really mean in practice. And if I may, can you tell us specifically how nature restoration can lead to tangible results on the ground and what it implies to farmers and landowners? And how do you see the costs and benefits of nature restoration playing out and at what timescale? Your comments very welcome.
Okay, thanks very much. And I must say I agree with a lot of what the previous speakers have said. And we get those messages and we're trying to build on that kind of approach, the systemic approach and the integrated approach in our project, and working closely with all the different stakeholders involved there. So it's a new way of working in a way, but it's been around for a long time. We know that we need to work this way, but it's only now that I see more and more integrated approach. So just to give an example of one aspect of our project, we are called Life IP Wild Atlantic Nature. So our main focus is conservation and restoration of blanket bog habitat, which is quite a rare habitat, an important habitat for biodiversity, but also for water quality, also for climate change with carbon-rich soils, etc. So straight away we see the integration of different aspects there. Our project covers about 250,000 hectares across the northwest coast of Ireland. And one key factor is that the vast majority of that land is privately owned and it's actively farmed. So we've got about 10,000 farmers who are active in our project area. So they are the number one most important stakeholder for us to work with and to come up with solutions that work for farmers, for local communities, and also for nature. So that's the key aspect there. And the primary mechanism that we use to do that is through results-based payment scheme approach. So this is an agri-environmental scheme approach where payments to farmers are directly related to the ecological quality of the land. So the more biodiversity, the higher the water quality, the better the carbon sequestration and storage, the higher the payments to the farmer. So the way we assess the ecological quality is quite simple. It's a scorecard which is two sides. You probably can't see it from there, but it's two sides of an A4 page. And what it captures is levels of biodiversity, water quality through filtration and through flood management, etc., and a climate regulation through carbon sequestration and storage. And the scorecard is intuitive to farmers. Farmers can understand it. If you bring them out for an hour or two on their field, they can say, yes, I can see what you're looking for, etc. But it's also backed up by robust scientific evidence. So even though it's simple to use and a 12-year-old could use the scorecard, there's real strong scientific evidence that if you score well on that scorecard, you can almost guarantee there is good high levels of biodiversity, there's good quality water, and there's good climate regulation associated with that land. So I think that one key aspect, okay, the farmer, if he scores high, gets a high payment, what does he have to do? Doesn't necessarily have to do anything. It's for good past management. The land is in good condition, so the farmer has been farming with nature, etc. But the key feature is that if the farmer gets a low score on a piece of land for any given reason, we have got supports available to help the farmer to bring up that score. So the type of supports would be training supports for training on different restoration works that the farmer may need to address, financial support for labour, materials that might be used to undertake restoration actions, and technical support in terms of regulations, licensing, just know-how, the knowledge, Hans thought about the best way to deal with the issues, etc. And so if the farmer says, well, what do I have to do to improve my score? Then he can just go back to the scorecard. He or she, they look and they say, okay, where did I not get full marks on the scorecard? These are the issues I need to address. So the scorecard becomes a very effective management tool that the farmer can use. They can also predict how their payments might change if they address some of the issues on the land. Another key feature is that the restoration actions are entirely voluntary. So the farmer you're not forcing the farmer, it's not prescriptive, you're not telling them they have to do A, B, or C. You're saying, here are the options available to you. If you do X, Y, Z, you will receive a higher payment. If you're happy with the way things are, as long as you're not breaking any law, etc., then so be it. So the farmers really like to have that flexibility to continue to farm the land and have the options for, like, if you, for want of a better phrase, markets for ecosystem services. It's not the language we'd use with farmers, but it's the language maybe it's something like this. So final point, we ran a pilot scheme along these lines last year for 160 farmers in one 25,000 hectare area with an uptake of over 85% of farmers, so there's real appetite there. This year we're going to 6-7 other sites and we will have 900 farmers. And from 2023, this results-based approach for high nature value areas is going to be implemented via the Common Agriculture Policy Agri-Environment Climate Measure for Ireland for 20,000 farmers. So we do have the template there to deliver this at scale, and any reasons, as Hans alluded to, are probably political for not doing this type of approach in the future. So that's some of the work we're doing with farmers, and Gary, really exciting for the future, I think.
No, that's really great, because first you have shown how restoration links land, water, climate, and so forth, but especially you have shown this is not about putting farmers aside or going against their livelihoods. And indeed, I think the results payment scheme you described, it changes the psychology of it. I have another crop, which is nature. So thank you very much for this input. Time is kicking. So for this next round, I'll ask you to be quick in your reply so that we can pick some questions from the audience. But getting back to you, Yannis, you did refer to the short term versus the long term, but indeed, the economic thinking and the electoral cycles, they are very much short term. So how can we act so as to put meaningful practices on nature restoration that may require a much longer perspective on getting results? Your comment on this?
Indeed. Actually, one thing which I would correct, we will always behave short-term because we live here and now. It's only the question, either we are selfish looking only to maximizing our own benefits now, or we are acting responsibly enough so that we take the interests also of the other living beings and future generations into our account. Where I see basically the problem, because when I was a student of economy, they taught us that we are behaving rationally, which we are, but unfortunately, signals which we are getting through the market are not leading us to a rational long-term behavior. Mm-hmm. So labor is undervalued, nature in many cases not valued at all, so nobody is actually paying for destroying the nature, which leads to really systemic social and environmental imbalances in the long term. Imagine just that you would be a food customer entering a food shop and not paying there. So the shop would obviously got bankrupt. So it's like you are, like we are, that's exactly the way we are behaving via the nature. So we go there, we shop, we don't pay, and we think that the nature don't get bankrupt. So it will get bankrupt because simply we behave that way. Another thing, an important point is that in all efforts which we do, also international, we are focusing predominantly on the supply side, which means cleaning the existing economic systems and not really asking on the demand side, which puts, first of all, a lot of more potential for good and promising policy answers, but it's also putting on the table a lot of questions which are connected to equity, to fairness, because it's pointing actually to who is over-consuming, which means that in high-income countries, we absolutely need to put on the top of efficiency policies also the sufficiency policies on the table, because I think without that it will simply not work. So it's all that it's happening in a bit of confusion in the markets, because all, like you, like I was, all regulators try to put on the market some responsible behavior. But on the other hand, the signals which are coming from the market to consumers and producers are just the opposite. So in one way, how can we ask consumer to behave rationally and on the other hand, ask him to pay for every environmentally produced food more? So it's absolutely irrational.
So in the end, we need a big upgrade of our economic system and social system.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Without that, I think we will simply, so it's about reassessing our values, rethinking our economies, reducing our consumption and virgin natural resources. And last point, so you were absolutely right about that there are still the shadows of, you call it neo-colonial world. I would say it of previous imperialist world, where wealthy nations pursue their ambitions on the expense of others. So we need to be aware that we are those who have created the rules of the game which lead us where we are. So it is absolutely clear who is responsible for the situation in which we are currently.
Yes.
Responsibility for the past, it's ours, but responsibility for the future, it's joint. This is not giving anybody a carte blanche that does repeat the mistakes done in the past.
Yes, it's the fairness and equity element
Yes.
of this. Thank you very much, Yannis. Let me try to get a bit of input from the other speakers. Esmeralda, a quick question for you would be, well, restoration, people often think that's about protected areas or landscape, but we can do restoration in cities. And with so many youngsters living in cities, I wonder if the urban side of restoration would sound more appealing than other elements of restoration.
I definitely think that all sides of restoration are super important. And indeed, in cities, maybe even more. As part of a youth community where many people study in cities or get their first job in cities, I believe it's really important to have nature restoration also there, because it can also help with other things such as climate adaptation or connecting people to nature, to really shift towards transformative education so that people are connected to nature and can actually start taking action for biodiversity. But to go even beyond that, I think nature restoration in cities is not even just an option anymore. It is absolutely necessary. Like, I come from the eastern part of Belgium, and last summer my hometown got flooded. And one of the causes of this is that our rivers are not what they were before. They are not able to contain the water anymore when rainfalls increase because of climate change. And so many livelihoods have been destroyed, and still today there are many consequences of it. So I think that nature restoration in cities is not just like something nice to see more trees in a city or to see a river with more like meanders. It is also guaranteeing basic human rights and right to life for the people who live in those cities. So I think we really need to think from that perspective as well. So it's not just making a landscape more beautiful. In cities, it can also be just trying to guarantee basic human rights and equity for people who are living in cities.
Indeed, I think flood protection is an ecosystem service everyone will understand easily. Thank you very much for that. Hans, I'm turning to you. Among several stakeholders, there are those that do not deny there's a biodiversity crisis, but some say yes, but the climate crisis or the energy crisis is more important. What would you say to those? And maybe just to add an element that came from a question of the audience, how can we make investors moving into putting money on nature restoration?
Okay, well, I think that's a great question, but the simple answer is that I think it's a false dichotomy, yeah? And that can stem from a lack of understanding. Then we should explain it better as knowledge players. It can be a lobbying strategy, as some are now misusing the war in Ukraine to come with slowdown tactics on parts of the European Green Deal, which I think is ethically deplorable. Or it can come from the fact that we have organized ourselves in a rather fragmented way, and that these things are traditionally discussed in different bubbles of the policy making, but also of the scientific system. But it's a false dichotomy. And if you just look at the ambitions of Europe for net zero by mid-century, well, we will not get there without strong ecosystems. I mean, the natural carbon cycle, carbon sequestration, removals in the natural cycle are a fundamental element of that. So investing in nature is part of working with climate change. Now, we are in a situation where climate change is starting to work against that. So that only illustrates the urgency of speeding up and scaling up, the joint approaches to that. And this, of course, brings us to what are the fundamental drivers? And they are the same for climate change as for biodiversity loss. They are our food system. I didn't say agriculture, yeah, I said the food system, because I don't think that by focusing on farmers, we are helping the cause a lot. They are blamed for a lot, whereas I think they are increasingly the victims of a system, a food system that is fundamentally unsustainable. We have to look at our energy system, but also at how we use resources, and that includes production and consumption. So if we focus on the drivers of those two crises, they are the same, and addressing the core sustainability questions of those drivers, and that includes distributional issues, as I think Esmeralda has so eloquently put on the table. I think that's when we will be on a trajectory that leads us to fundamentally sustainable Earth systems, which are the foundation for any future of humanity on this planet.
Thank you so much, Hans. Again, I'm more and more convinced we have one crisis, which is the sustainability one, with all interconnected. And back to you, Gary. What I would ask you is, you know, there are some that the word restoration sounds like rewilding and putting farmland aside and whatsoever, and nothing to do with active land management. But in some cases, for instance, in the Irish context, where you have degraded peatland needing rewetting, how can you dialogue with farmers on this kind of context, showing them there's a role for them, and this is not about putting farming aside?
Yeah, good questions. And I mean, they're exactly the type of questions farmers would ask us when we tell them about the scheme and ask them if they're interested in joining, etc. And I guess nature restoration can take many different forms, and it can mean different things to different people. And even the word rewilding, if we asked everybody here today, what does rewilding mean? Everyone will tell you something different, because it means different things to different people. But what I would say is that the results-based approach is a very good mechanism for delivering the objectives and the outcomes that you want to achieve. There has to be agreement on what those objectives are. For us, it's active land management. We want to see the land actively managed, and we can show the farmer our scorecard, the type of questions we're asking and the type of weightings that we're allocating scores for. And they can clearly see that it's not abandonment that we are looking for, because if land was abandoned, it would not score so well on our scorecard. So they can clearly get the message of active land management is what we're trying, and that alleviates some fear that farmers have that we want them to abandon high nature value areas. Also in terms of the re-wetting and the bigger jobs like maybe drain blocking, yes, it does need to be done in many instances, especially for climate change, also biodiversity. But the results-based system is very well developed in Ireland, starting with the Burn programme, Burn Life programme 20 years ago, and building the European Innovation Partnerships, Hin Harrier project, Pearl Mussel project, etc. And farmers, you know, you need pioneer farmers who will do the work first, and then farmers learn from other farmers, because I could talk to farmers all day, but where they really learn is when they see another farmer talk to another farmer. So farmers have drain blocked, they have re-wetted peatlands, and they're still able to manage livestock on the land, etc. They haven't ended up underwater, and for other farmers to see that is extremely important. And I think that, you know, the farmers do respond very well to policy and to incentives. And if you get the policy right, then the farmers will come along and follow that. And farmers have really been the victims in the past of poor policy, you know, around stocking rates, around productive approaches in areas where there's marginal land and it doesn't really suit farming in that area. It's this one-size-fits-all measure. So having locally adapted results-based approaches, you can tailor what you want and what you reward for those areas. And farmers can clearly see that, you know, so they come along on board with you on the journey, and it's very powerful that way. I mean, I've got a few pictures if you want to see the type of area that we do work in, because
I think we could accommodate to 1 minute.
1 minute. Well, I'll be very quick.
Yes.
I don't know where the pictures are going to appear, but
is you in controlling the pictures or someone else?
well, they gave me this, but I don't.
Okay, give it a try. Okay.
Here we go. That's our logo. You don't want to see that.
Pictures
So
are
this
very
is a
telling,
typical blanket bog habitat, and this would be in very good condition. So on our results-based approach, you would be scoring, you know, 8, 9, 10 here if this is the land that you're farming, etc. So you're getting a good payment, nice clean water, good levels of biodiversity, etc. And here we have just a picture along a fence line. You can see on the right-hand side, okay, medium quality, there's some cleared forestry, etc. So maybe a medium to low payment. But on the left-hand side, there's a lot of bare soil, erosion, overgrazing, etc. So this would not receive a payment, but the supports will be there for the farmer to deal with these issues. And these are the type of things. So when we talk about drain blocking, it doesn't have to be this huge. And a lot of these works are, you know, tweaks to management, small pieces. Here we have a farmer that had a drain coming down the mountain, an open drain, and running straight into a Pearl Mussel river, bringing sediment, etc., and being a threat to water quality. And some very simple timber weirs slow down the flow. The vegetation starts to grow behind, filter the water, etc. And you can see we're walking around the drain and we're still standing on the ground. We're not underwater by any means. This is a farmer in the Pearl Mussel project. And here we're chatting to a farmer where he's got rhododendron, which is ponticum, an invasive species in the peatlands in the west of Ireland. And he's also got a conifer plantation in a special area of conservation that he's looking for us to assist with removing as well. So we're measuring peat depths, etc., and trying to work with a farmer on how to deal with it. So these are kind of some of the bigger issues. Oftentimes it's a livestock crossing, it's a little bit of fencing, or maybe removing fencing, etc. So very practical issues that the farmer can do themselves on their own land and benefit from through higher payments.
Well, thanks a lot, Gary. I think pictures really help a lot, but I retain also the lesson. You need a farmer to speak to a farmer, not a bureaucrat or an NGO only. Yeah? But now we have some 11 minutes. I think we can still pick some questions from the audience I have here for quick replies. And there's one for you, Yannis, I think, which is, yes, we spoke about food security, but what about food sovereignty? Do we need food sovereignty? Are we as EU forgetting this element? We need a balance on this discussion. If you could go for 1 minute on food sovereignty, that would be good.
Actually, of course, going more, but a lot of the things we are talking about, a lot of the things which are also connected to the concept of circularity is going more local. So shortening the distribution chains and so on. So of course, food sovereignty, it's important, but that's simply part of the discussion which we have to integrate. So nothing more to say.
So it's not a dichotomy, but something that
No.
needs to be tackled within that.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you very much. Gary, I have actually one that goes for you, which is about the scoreboard. You've shown how scalable it is for other farming systems, but also other sectors, including industry or whatever. Would you comment on your scoreboard?
Yeah, certainly. I can talk to the point of other farming sectors. Industry it might be a bit beyond what we're doing. But so one important aspect of the scorecard is that it's designed locally adapted to the local area, so the type of habitat that you're working in, and also that it's designed with all the different stakeholders involved. So for us, we're looking at biodiversity, water quality, climate. So we would get, as well as the farmers involved in the design of the scorecard, also our biodiversity experts, our waters people, our climate people in there. And so our scorecard, we actually have 3 scorecards in our project, one for peatland, one for grassland, and one for woodland and scrub. So these are the type of habitats, and depending on the farmer can own all 3 types of habitats, so you take a whole farm approach. We also have other projects in Ireland looking at scorecards for macaire, which are dune systems. We have projects, like I mentioned, hen harrier and pearl mussel, who have scorecards that target particular species, so supporting habitat for the likes of the hen harrier, etc. So the scorecards can be adapted. What's important is that the underlying principles remain the same, and that, the template is there for how to roll these out, and it's up to the local actors to decide on what does a 10 out of 10 look like for me in this landscape. That's where you start, and then you start working back from there to start rewarding, to incentivize to get towards that 10 mark. 10 might not be always possible for everyone, but to get up at 8, 7, 8, 9 high scores. So.
Thank you a lot. I'm sure scorecards can certainly be adapted to different farming systems. I've seen something similar in Switzerland also. When I can add from my side, let's say big retail on food can certainly have their own kind of scoreboards on their impacts on water, land, air, biodiversity. Thanks for that. Now I would have here a question which is general, and maybe Hans would like to start tackling with it, which is the speakers. We have been talking a lot about humanity's unhealthy relationship with nature, but what can we say about how the restoration law specifically could rebalance or help? So maybe this could be our final round. I'll start with Hans. For 1 minute, what's your expectation on the potential of the nature restoration law? You don't know it, of course, yet, but you could speculate maybe.
I've heard rumors about it, Umberto. So, no, of course, the potential is massive and essential. It will contribute to society in all possible ways. It will contribute to well-being. It will contribute to health issues. It will contribute to fighting climate change impacts, as Meralda mentioned in her part of Belgium. We have to do it. The potential is massive. And there are 2 elements of good news. One, we know that under the right conditions, nature can bounce back surprisingly well. We all know the example of Yellowstone and some other examples. So if we do it well and we really focus on it, we can do it. And the other good news is that we know where the drivers are. So if we take those 2 elements seriously, I think there is a really positive scope for a massive improvement and a way forward that we will benefit from as a society.
Thank you, Hans. Esmeralda, any thoughts from your side on expectations on the nature restoration law?
Yes, I want to start by saying that we are part of nature. I think it's always important to remind that. And I think a good example was what Gary presented, who really showed that actually you can achieve a high level of biodiversity together with human activities. So we are part of those who contribute to healthy ecosystems as well. So I think by really engaging stakeholders in the nature restoration processes, we can get this connection with the rest of nature that we lost.
Thank you so much. And Gary, your comments on what you could expect from a nature restoration law?
Yeah, so one thing that I would say from our perspective is that the nature restoration law or any such policies like that one thing that's very important is that they bring certainty and they bring continuity and they bring a clear direction and a clear policy message that this is the way forward. And I think that's very, very important for the likes of a farmer who's wondering, should I reduce my stocking numbers? Should I increase, etc.? And it's not something that they can just switch on and off. But when you have the continuity there, and then the farmer has certainty, they have confidence that this is going to be around for the long term, this is the direction we're going, then they will react. And I think we have found that in our project, that as soon as the results-based approach was written into the CAP strategic plan for Ireland, we were flooded with farmers interested to come on board because they know this is where their payments are going to be going towards until 2027 at least in this round of CAP and then beyond. So that certainty is very important for landowners and farmers, and the clear, consistent policy messaging I think is really important, and the integration of different land use policies.
Thanks so much. You did refer to the results of bad policy making. We are trying to make it more and more integrated. It's not so easy, but we keep trying. Yannis, for you, I would not only ask the same what you expect from a nature restoration law, but another issue that came is how can we indeed move investors to consider meaningful to put money on nature restoration? Maybe you want to tackle both together in these final minutes.
Yeah, to start with the last, I think it's essential that the rules of the game on the markets are basically re-established, and that we start to understand that investors and everybody who is stimulating them starts to understand that the risk management which today consider is simply too narrow, and that they are part of the broader society which is responsible for the common future. Because without that, there is no common future. On the question about the expectations, since of course Hans is much more informed in details and needs to be, I would have nothing to add what he has said, and Esmeralda was absolutely pointing to the right thing, that is the not seeing humans as part of the nature is leading to something which I used to call charming mass suicide. So it's essential that we understand that with nature restoration, we are doing favor to ourselves. And the last message which I'm repeating quite frequently lately, if we really want to protect extinction of elephants in the nature, we need to extinct elephants in our rooms.
That's a very good point. Thank you very much. I'm tempted. You got yourself a round of applause on that. I'm tempted to give you my final comment as moderator, picking exactly on what you said, because very often in these debates it looks like when we are promoting nature policy, that's for the sake of nature and putting humans a bit aside. Now, of course, one issue is human impacts that we need to restrict or moderate or change. But this is all about human interest. You know, we all know that Hans referred to the 6 great extinction. There were 5 before, but guess what? With time, that's what the geological record shows us, they have recovered with even bigger biodiversity. So don't worry for the planet or for biodiversity, because in some millions of years, this will be lovely again. But we humans don't really measure our things in millions of years, which 1 million of years is 10,000 centuries. We are short-term thinkers, but it's for our interest indeed that we need to bring nature back into our lives, because we depend on it, because we are more happy with it, and I'm convinced for that nature restoration will be a very essential element, bringing in economic activity, bringing in, I hope, jobs and opportunities for the youth. Yes, and I can tell you for my own kids, they do like nature. And I've also noticed, Esmeralda, in the youth demonstrations, that the panels, they don't refer only to climate. Indeed, I've seen from polar bears to nature and bees, etc. out there. So I hope this has matched the expectations of all of you in the audience. I want to give a big thanks to our speakers that do deserve another round of applause, please. and not forgetting all that they've contributed, not to the whole of the Green Week, but to this session particularly, including my colleagues that have been out there managing Slido, answering to our questions and filtering some to me here as moderator. So maybe another and final round of applause and we close. Thank you very much. Thank you.